So finally, Patrick, welcome. It's been a year, almost a year since we talked, and I thought you would make a terrific presenter for HASP. I'm so glad and pleased to introduce you. Patrick is a community developer at heart who has spent most of his career in nonprofit, working to make the Holland-Zeeland area the best it can be for all who live here. Currently, Patrick serves as the president and CEO of the Community Foundation of Holland-Zeeland, where he helps to build our community's endowment to support high-impact charitable projects, as well as working with donors to achieve their charitable goals. Prior to that, Patrick served for 10 years as the founding executive director of two partner nonprofits in the Lakeshore Nonprofit Alliance and Community Spoke, where he helped to strengthen our local nonprofit sector and facilitating nonprofit and government collaboration. That's a mouthful. Patrick holds a bachelor's degree in economics and Spanish from DePauw University. Locally, he is a graduate of West Coast Leadership and has earned the Innovation Methods certification from the New North Center for Design and Business, which I had to look up to find out exactly what that was. Patrick is the current chair of the board for the Corwell Health Zeeland Hospital, as well as a member of the Lakeshore Leadership Council. I'm going to skip right to the one that caught my attention when I read this. In previous volunteer capacities, he has served as co-organizer for TEDx Makatawa. And I learned that he was a founder of TEDx Makatawa. In 2021, he was recognized as a Grand Rapids Business Journal's 40 Under 40 recipient. Patrick, welcome. It is good to have you.
Thank you. Thank you, Doug. I appreciate it. Happy to be here. Happy to have the opportunity to give this presentation. I didn't know who would be here this morning, so it is so fun to see old friends, old board members, and even my old tennis coach, who I haven't seen in like 20 some years. So very, very cool. I didn't know if I would be welcomed back at HASP. I was telling someone this morning, 4 years ago was the last time I was scheduled to give a presentation with Brian Davis, the former superintendent of Holland Public here, and my son was born a month early, and I remember calling him Brian at like 7 in the morning and saying, Brian, you're gonna have to go solo. So I didn't know if I was gonna be welcome back. So it's good to be back. So I'm excited to share this presentation. I won't share much more about the Community Foundation other than kind of our core focus is really to connect charitable resources to community needs and opportunities. And so philanthropy is what we think about all day long. It is about walking alongside donors and helping them use their charitable resources for good. And so philanthropy is it. Philanthropy is literally what runs through my mind every day. And we often at the Community Foundation are telling stories of local philanthropy, local impact, telling the stories of local nonprofits and the work that they're doing. But this was a fun exercise for me in kind of taking a step back and thinking about the role of philanthropy from a national perspective in particular, but also a little bit of a global perspective. So to dive in, I want to kind of set the stage here, and we're talking about the past, present, and future of philanthropy. And when we talk about philanthropy, I often think of it in one of two ways. There's big P philanthropy, which it has its roots in kind of the Greek origin of the word, which is love for mankind, love for humankind. And so it's a broader definition than what we often think about when we think about philanthropy today. So I'm going to talk about kind of the arc of philanthropy in big P philanthropy terms, but then certainly a key aspect of that is that little p philanthropy, the giving of one's financial resources for charitable purposes. So I'm going to kind of bounce back and forth talking big P and little p philanthropy. And I also want to say that today really is honing in on the American story of philanthropy. And I want to just name that's not to say that philanthropy and charitable intent is not cultural in other parts of the world, but I do want to make the argument that it is a uniquely American experience. And the story of how philanthropy has evolved here really is quite special. And part of my motivation for giving this presentation is just to elevate philanthropy's role in creating this country. That if I were to poll any one of you, if I were to poll people on the street and just say, hey, what's made the United States a great nation over time? You'd hear the great democratic experiment, the free society, the capitalist economic structure, or innovation, invention, culture, pop culture, military might, all of these things. And how long down that list before someone says philanthropy? Philanthropy has played a critical role. I firmly believe with JFK, and I love this quote here that highlights just how special philanthropy is in the American tradition. So to talk about the past of philanthropy, and to set the stage here, there's a question that I've kind of wrestled with in other presentations and in other settings, and it's this idea of who provides for social good in society. Or a better way, perhaps, of asking that is, where do the people, in any given moment in time, where do the people look to for social good in society? When I say social good, like that helping hand, that lifting someone up, supporting folks on the margins, folks that are in need, where do the people throughout time kind of look to for that social good? And if you kind of go back through history, and for most of our history, you didn't have to go very far. It was the tribe or the family. There were small communes, and if anyone ever, if you needed help, if you needed support, that you looked to those who were closest around you. It was often small family units, small tribal units, and again, that was the case for most of human history. We then see the rise in kind of core cities, and cities being built up, these centralized governments. Think of Rome, you think of empires. And with the rise of cities, you don't see a big movement in terms of kind of social good being provided, that kind of social welfare that we think that government provides today. You see more the building up of infrastructure, or building up a place for commerce to take place, building up of providing defense for the people. But there are instances where you do see centralized government early on providing some of that kind of social good as I've framed it. The Song dynasty, for example, in China in 10 AD, actually did have relief for the poor. They had soup kitchens, they had orphanages. So you see glimpses of kind of centralized government starting to think about caring for the people's needs, kind of their social needs, their social welfare, but not to a large degree as of yet. The next big movement, and I should say these are not linear movements, right? These are co-occurring. But the next big movement that you see in history in terms of kind of big P philanthropy, love for mankind, is the rise of organized religion. And particularly in the Western part of the world with Christianity, the Catholic Church, Middle Ages in particular, you start to see organized relief and care for the poor, collecting alms and giving to the poor. You see orphanages, you see houses being set up for folks who are sick or older individuals. You see hospitals, you see educational institutions begin to crop up because there's this organized church that is providing it. You see it in other parts of the world as well, though. This is not a uniquely Christian experience. You have in the Muslim world something called akef, which is really taking land and turning it into providing for widows, for orphanages, and for those in need. And so you see that throughout the past several centuries, and is still a practice that is done today. So the emergence of organized religion kind of provide, where do the people look to? Keep asking that question. Where do the people look to have for social good to be met in society? Then we see a glimpse of government really making a pretty significant move in the arc of philanthropy. And it happens in 1601 in British Parliament, and they pass what's called the Statute of Charitable Uses, which really starts to shift the responsibility of locally elected officials, giving them the responsibility to care for folks who are in their district. The expectation is shifted. You are responsible for caring for your people in the word at the time was in your parish, in your district. And a big reason that this comes about is this is post religious wars that are taking place in Europe, and Catholicism is not in England as it once was. You don't have that organized religion as you once did. And so in a void and an absence of providing that social good, where do the people look to? Government starts to play a more significant role. Let's shift to the American story, though. So, teeing up some key kind of movements throughout history. But again, I really want to focus on the American story. And the American experience really is a unique one. So, if you picture those kind of the early founding of our country, you have settlers coming from many different countries and settling the land here. And they came with a sense of how to provide social good. They saw models in Europe. You saw the church providing educational institutions or hospitals. You had guilds in Europe that had kind of a mutual support mechanism, kind of like a carpenter guild that they provide for each other. You had some of the state and some of the crown providing some support, but in the absence of the crown, the state, the church, in early founding of the United States, who was going to provide that? And so they looked to each other. And so you see this rise of things like mutual aid societies where communities came together and they pitched in their money. Hey, we're all going to throw money into the pot. And when someone is sick, when someone is in need, they get to draw from it. You see the rise of associations where we want to build a school, we want to build a church, we want to build a library. Let's all come together. Let's pool our resources. Let's volunteer and let's build this up. That is a uniquely American experience and really key to how our country was founded and how it was built up over time. So you had these European models, but this new style of kind of American philanthropy. And I love this. I won't read all of this, but I love this Alexis de Tocqueville quote, who was, of course, a Frenchman who came and toured the United States and really told about this great democratic experience in his book, Democracy in America. And he says, Americans of all ages, all conditions, all dispositions constantly form associations. They have not only commercial and manufacturing companies in which all take part, but associations of 1,000 other kinds: religious, moral, serious, feudal, extensive or restricted, enormous or diminutive. The Americans make associations to give entertainment, to found establishments for education, to build inns, to construct churches, to diffuse books, on and on. And in comparing to Europe, he says, wherever at the head of some new undertaking, you see the government in France or a man of rank in England, in the United States, you will be sure to find an association. So it's a unique part of our history that the people we're chipping in, we're volunteering, we're putting our money in the pot to see the community that we want to see. So that takes place for literally hundreds of years as part of our American history. But the next kind of big movement that I will highlight is George Peabody establishing the first modern foundation. He forms the Peabody Education Fund. Now, George Peabody was a financier. He was the real wealth behind what became the House of Morgan, J.P. Morgan, and the lineages, that the wealth they accumulated, the banking industry. George Peabody was kind of the initial resource behind a lot of that. And he turns to giving money back later in life and forms the first real modern foundation. He's often referred to as the father of modern philanthropy. And the reason they say that is he's the first to really create a permanent asset of which he's going to grant dollars back out to charitable causes over a period of time. He's also the first to actually hire professional staff to oversee that grant making on his behalf. So he gives to a lot of causes. He builds up public schools and supports public schools. He gives funding to build low-income housing. He helps to focus on Black and white integration in the post-Civil War South. And so he is what we call the father of modern philanthropy. Of course, what he would originally do, as you'll hear in a moment, others would take and really augment what a foundation can look like. In the late 1800s, we see the rise. I used major nonprofits. Of course, they weren't called nonprofits at the time. You could say major charitable organizations get their start. And again, throughout our history, you had these volunteer associations where they were all volunteers. They were loose structures. But in the late 1800s, we start to see the rise of more organized organizations, charitable organizations. Some familiar ones here: Red Cross, which was founded in war-torn Italy at the time as a relief effort. We had an American Civil War nurse that would understand that model and bring it to the United States to provide those relief efforts. We have the Salvation Army, which was an evangelical organization, but wanted to also provide a helping hand, which that model certainly has grown to over 120 countries today. And the United Way, which was created in Denver as a way to bring Christian and Jewish leaders together who were trying that wanted to raise money in a central pot, of which they then granted those dollars out to 22 local organizations to provide social relief efforts. So if you know the model of United Way today, that's very much what it is: raising money in one pot and then giving those dollars out to local organizations. And part of the reason you saw the rise of these charitable organizations in the late 1800s was in part due to industrialization. You had people flocking to the cities. They were going to work in manufacturing and industry. And when people came into the cities in mass, you had poverty crop up. You had health issues crop up. There were social needs that were magnified. And so these organizations, they had to become more organized to help with those relief efforts. Taking a snapshot back here now at the global level, a little bit away from the American story, but a very monumental shift here in Big P philanthropy. We see government reforms take place in Germany. National Civil Code in 1881, which is the first time that there's a creation of a for-profit and a nonprofit class. And in Germany actually incentivizes giving to that nonprofit class. Of course, that would then begin to spread in other governments around the world. Old age insurance in 1889 under the leadership of Otto von Bismarck at the time, and the reforms under his leadership. You saw old age insurance, kind of like Social Security insurance. You saw sick care insurance. You saw workers' comp be developed. So Germany was really at the forefront of some of these reforms. And again, back to that Big P philanthropy, where do the people look to? You're starting to see government step in a little bit more significant role than they had in the past. Of course, Britain would follow suit pretty shortly after with these reforms. And then, of course, in the United States, with the New Deal, you start to see these come into our history. Of course, you cannot tell the history of philanthropy without highlighting some of what I would call are kind of the titans of philanthropy in the U.S. Story. And before I highlight these, I do want to I want to name kind of the moral conflict that also comes with philanthropy, because I don't want to ignore that. I don't want to dwell and spend too much time on it. But there is the sad reality that much of the wealth that has been accumulated in this country over time was not necessarily accumulated in the morally best ways, right? So these men became wealthy during industrialization. People, their workers are working long hours for meager wages, unsafe conditions. Often when they striked for, when they went on strike for better conditions, they were often beaten or even killed. And I don't want to gloss over that because that is a reality that is part of our story. But I'm choosing in this presentation to focus on what the good of the philanthropy has done in the history of our country. So Andrew Carnegie, perhaps the most well-known philanthropist, a Scottish immigrant who kind of true rags to riches story, came here, worked in the railroad industry, and then certainly built up his steel empire, ultimately sold that to JP Morgan for $500 million, making him the wealthiest American at the time. He would create the Carnegie Corporation and look to give his resources back. He would fund a number of things, including building over 2,800 libraries in this country. Really setting the foundation for that library infrastructure in our country. And the reason he did that was, as a youth, there was a local businessman who opened up his own personal library to Carnegie and other youth in the area. And that stuck. And it really kind of highlights just how personal philanthropy is to each donor. So over 2,800 libraries. He would go on, of course, to found Carnegie Mellon University, one of the top research institutions. He would ultimately lend his name to Carnegie Hall. That was not his brainchild, but Carnegie Hall was struggling to bring European entertainers to the U.S. who just thought it was a dark, dingy hall, and Carnegie lent his name, and it became a hall of prominence, of course. And he was very well known, not just for the giving that he did, but for the writing that he did about giving. So he wrote the Gospel of Wealth, which became kind of a manifesto for future philanthropists to kind of guide their philanthropy as well. And he believed very, very deeply that that once you have your own needs met and the needs of your family, everything else should go back. You should give everything else away. In his Gospel of Wealth, he writes, "Man who dies thus rich dies disgraced." And that was core to his giving mentality. John D. Rockefeller, of course, of Standard Oil fame, captured 90% of the oil market here in the U.S. at one point, also one of the wealthiest Americans of all time. His giving was different than Carnegie's. When it came time to give, he gave very much out of religious conviction. Rockefeller was a deeply religious man. And he also thought about his giving. If you look at his pattern of giving, it was very much root cause oriented. So he gave mass amounts of wealth to address healthcare issues. Funding directly from he and his foundation would go on to fund the vaccines that were created for meningitis, yellow fever, hookworm. His foundation would step in over time when there were big public health crises around the world and provide significant funding. But he also thought further upstream, kind of root cause when it came to the post-Civil War South. He funded lots of education for Black individuals in the South, including several Black-only colleges that were being created at the time. And he very much saw that as a way out of poverty, that if you can get educated, you can get out of poverty. Of course, his philanthropy would really be stepped up with the creation of the foundation, and his son, John Jr., would take a significant role in building that up. He also, I'll share this, Rockefeller also known for creating schools at Johns Hopkins and Harvard, and was really the funding behind the University of Chicago. And again, that education, that swimming further upstream. And then Henry Ford, of course, of Ford Motor Company fame and the innovations of the assembly line. Also kind of a little bit of a rags to riches story, a very meager beginning to getting to where he was. Always very charitable, and his charity differed also from Carnegie and Rockefeller. Ford was famous for just not really caring about money. And if you read his biographies, there's really funny stories of him leaving like 6-figure checks in his coat pocket and leaving them at the dry cleaners or leaving them out in public. Like he just didn't feel like he needed the wealth. And so he gave at a very early on when he was accumulating his wealth. He also saw giving as something that should be done in private, behind closed doors, and really to help like specific individuals. He had a little bit of lack of trust for major organizations and institutions. And so most of his giving was done directly in private. However, of course, he is known. His name's attached to quite a few things that are larger in nature. You think of Henry Ford Hospital, which he was the real resources behind. And the impetus for that was he saw that there were hospitals that provided for the wealthy. There were hospitals that provided for the poor, but there wasn't a hospital for your average person that could pay a little bit towards their healthcare needs. And that drove him to help build the Henry Ford Hospital. Of course, Greenfield Village out in Detroit as well, which his biographers would point out is funny that he spent so much time and resources preserving the past, and yet he was one of the core people who brought us into the future, right? But he did want to preserve and capture so much of the past. And then certainly his foundation, similar to Carnegie and Rockefeller, would go on to have just tremendous influence. At one point, I think this is fascinating. At one point, gave a special appropriation of $560 million, the equivalent of $5 billion today, to every single private college and hospital in this country. Every single hospital and private college got a check from the Ford Foundation. That I don't have the hospital number, but that was 615 privately accredited colleges at the time. just a mass infusion of resources. His foundation also would be the biggest funder of research for in vitro fertilization that would lead to the first baby being born through that method in the United Kingdom. They provided funding to help get the public broadcasting station, PBS, off the ground, funded kids shows like Sesame Street, lots of fun stuff over time. So certainly these three individuals, there's many others, but these three really through their giving and their foundations had a monumental shift in the history of philanthropy. Shifting back to government here for a moment, Congress passes the Revenue Act of 1913. And so similar to what Germany did before, the US now creates a exempt organization if you're devoted to religious, charitable, scientific, or educational purposes, and you're exempt from paying federal tax. A follow-up legislation in 1936 would then would allow for your giving to be tax deductible. And so you see the birth of of charitable organizations, the nonprofit organization that was really triggered through this legislation. Of course, this is a little bit of a self-plug, but I think it's pretty significant. Frederick Goff would create the first community foundation, the Cleveland Community Foundation, in 1914. And that was a way to pool local resources, to have local donors give into a pot to provide for community projects and community support, like building up parks and libraries and schools. And I'm very grateful to Mr. Goff, as there are over 800 community foundations around the country today, including over 50 here in the state of Michigan. Michigan is a little bit of a hotbed of community foundations, and I believe we have gone on to do a lot of good work in our communities. Congress passes Social Security Act of 1935. And so again, where do the people look to for social good? This is a significant event, right? Where you're now having government that is providing for resources for folks later in life, post-retirement. And so where do the people look to? There's now a major component that the US government is providing. Another big shift out of from the 1930s and the 1960s, we see government expand social welfare programs, and many of these, which are household names, come about in the 60s. Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps. You see housing vouchers come about, and so this mass change where do the people look to have social, their social needs met? Big shift into government. Of course, the government would not necessarily create all of the service providers for these. They created the funding for it. But many of the organizations that would actually implement this work, that would receive the funding and implement it, are nonprofit organizations. And so we see a proliferation of nonprofit organizations. I captured up here just kind of the growth of nonprofits in this country by decade. You will see towards the bottom there's not much growth from 2010 to 2023. That's because the IRS did a mass reclassification of what a nonprofit is. But you can see this growth. And again, a lot of that growth kind of post 60s is because there was more funding. There was more government funding to meet the needs of the people. And so this gets us kind of up to the present, because the last several decades have kind of been the age of nonprofit organizations. You see nonprofits crop up to meet a wide variety of needs. Where there's a gap in terms of need, you see nonprofits start and help to step into that gap. And that very much has been kind of, again, where do the people look to? Nonprofits have been that kind of new class of organization. So those are some significant movements in kind of big P philanthropy in our history that kind of have gotten us to where we are today. But I want to tell a few stories to really highlight the power of philanthropy. And again, back to what I shared earlier, and I'm going to pause for a moment just to get my water. As I shared earlier, part of my motivation is to talk about the impact, the kind of unique American story. And I think philanthropy just hasn't had its day in the sun. I think there are stories that we just don't often think about in terms of the impact that it's had. So here's a few stories as to the role philanthropy has had. We spend a lot of time in our country trying to debate what our founding fathers 250 years ago would want for us today, right? I mean, that is an exercise that plays out often. And I don't know what they would say about a lot of things, but I do believe firmly that they would want they would want a culture of philanthropy in this country. And one of the untold stories is just how philanthropic our founding fathers actually were. Benjamin Franklin was a well-known philanthropist, gave many of his own dollars and resources to charitable causes, and helped. One story is he helped raise money for the first general hospital in this country in Philadelphia. He gave his own resources, but he was also a fundraiser. He went out and got additional dollars. He was also the one that we believe utilized the first matching gift. And so he had convinced the local assembly in Philadelphia that if I raise X amount of dollars, will you pitch in the same amount? And they did. And that's the first general hospital in our country. Was created in the early or mid 1700s, thanks to that effort. Thomas Jefferson was a famous philanthropist, funded a lot of educational efforts. University of Virginia was heavily funded by Jefferson. He firmly believed that if individuals could get educated, that would be the key in success to our country long term. And one of the little known stories that I just love is that George Washington was actually one of the most philanthropic individuals in history. We talk about, you read about him, we talk about him. He's the famous general. He's the first president. And yet he was a big philanthropist in his time. He, similar to Ford, gave a lot of his philanthropy was done in private. But one of the most significant gifts that he gave was a gift of $20,000 to Liberty Hall Academy, which is now known as Washington and Lee University. $20,000, which is believed at the time to be the largest gift to an educational institution at the time. I mean, the largest, George Washington, right? So I believe our founding fathers would have wanted us to carry on a tradition and a culture of philanthropy in this country. Speaking of educational institutions, our history of educational institutions is a uniquely philanthropic history. And the statistic that I love most is that at one point in our history, there were 37 colleges or universities in the state of Ohio, while there were 4 in total in England. 37 in the state of Ohio, 4 in the entire country of England, which at the time, was the most powerful country in the world, arguably. And the reason for that gets back to that early American story that Americans wanted to see education institutions. You didn't have the crown, the state, or the church to build them. Hey, let's locally raise dollars to build up these institutions. And they have flourished, certainly, over time. And so the first real college in this country, New College, founded in 1636 by Massachusetts Bay Colony, later renamed when a young minister, John Harvard, left his library and half his estate to the college. That philanthropic giving. And so many colleges, William and Mary, Yale, St. John's, Princeton, Columbia, all got their start kind of in those early days. But our American education story truly is a unique one. Philanthropy can turn the tide of war. This is Alfred Loomis. Alfred Loomis famously sold when the stock market was high before the crash in 1929 and bought back in shortly thereafter, but would turn his resources to charitable good shortly after that. After a return from Europe, where he saw what Hitler was doing, he became convinced that Hitler and Germany would bring the world to war, and that science would play a significant role in the result of that war. So he helped to charitably fund several labs in this country, including one that would ultimately create a new technology that would use radio waves to detect moving objects. Radar came about during the war. The Americans had it, the Germans didn't, and that was one of those significant scientific advancements that helped literally turn the tide of war. That came about through charitable funding. Fun fact about Alfred Loomis as well, he is also the great-grandfather of Reed Hastings, who is the founder of Netflix. So kind of passed on that innovative spirit, but also the philanthropic spirit, as Reed Hastings is a well-known philanthropist in his own right. One donor can change the world with their giving. This is Catherine McCormick. She inherited the International Harvester fortune, or much of that fortune. She was an early women's rights activist, and she was obsessed with the idea of what if you could take one pill to prevent pregnancy. And so she partners up with biologist Gregory Pincus and is the sole funder behind his lab and his work, which would ultimately create a FDA approved pill that is literally known as the pill. It's the only pill that's known as the pill. In 1957. And whether you think that was a good or a bad thing, it forever changed the world. The power of one donor, one donor's resource to change the world. Philanthropy has often plays a role in unexpected ways. This is one of the stories I absolutely love most. Motivated by a desire to bring books to the blind. Art patron Ada Moore and the Carnegie Corporation gave money to the American Foundation for the Blind to help make audiobooks. And so they experimented with a new patent for a long playing record, or LP, which was a larger double-sided record at the time. They experimented with different kinds of materials to create that. They ultimately landed on vinyl. And what do you know? They were able to put books fully on tape for the blind to listen to. They accomplished their goal. Of course, 14 years later, CBS would turn that not just for books, but they would put music on vinyl records, and pop culture was forever changed in this country. That origin is charitable dollars for a charitable purpose that ultimately has influenced our culture in a really profound way. Of course, a lot of the stories I'm telling are of wealthy donors, big foundations making impactful change. And yet most of the philanthropy that happens in this country is by everyday Americans. 75% of the giving that happens every year in this country is by individuals versus about 20% that come from foundations. And so there's lots of stories of everyday philanthropists. One of my favorite is this Osiala McCarty story. She had a very tragic childhood. She was actually born as a result of rape. She grew up as a washer girl. She washed clothes at a very young age. She had to drop out of school at 6th grade to care for an ailing aunt. And she would go on to wash clothes her entire life, working long, incredibly hard hours. But she was a saver. She saved her money. And when it came time for retirement in 1995, she'd saved $280,000, and she donated 150 of that to the University of Southern Mississippi to create scholarships for kids in need. And when that story spread, there were then 600 local donors who would also step up and give to her scholarship. And today, the university provides several full tuition McCarty scholarships. That is so cool. That's one story. Those stories happen every day in this country. And I love this quote: I can't do everything, but I can do something to help somebody. And what I can do, I will do. I wish I could do more. Yeah, it's beautiful. Philanthropy has saved countless millions of lives throughout history. And one prominent story is the story of polio in this country and the eradication of polio in this country. And I like this story because it kind of combines a couple that I have been sharing so far. It combines big resources, and in this case, the Rockefeller Foundation, which put up a massive amount of money to fund polio vaccine research, and the story of everyday Americans stepping up to support this effort as well. At the time, in the early 1900s, polio was killing more Americans than any other communicable disease. And so this was a challenge for us. So you have Rockefeller Institute that's funding, but then you have radio personality Eddie Cantor, who encourages Americans to give their loose change to the cause, urging listeners to create a march of dimes to reach all the way to the White House. Americans followed suit. They followed that advice. And between 1938 until 1955, March of Dimes raised nearly $50 million for that effort. And so, you know, many of us still get the envelope in the mail for March of Dimes every year. And I think many folks forget what it was originally designed for. It was to create the vaccine to eradicate polio, which we did. In 1952, there was a deadly outbreak, and Dr. Jonas Salk and Albert Sabin created the vaccine. And by 1979, polio was eradicated in the United States. That's a remarkable story of philanthropy. And then the last one I'll just highlight is that there's many structures in our society today that we just don't often attribute to being kind of philanthropy at the core. And so one of those examples is health insurance. That until 1930, that whole concept really didn't exist in this country until two gentlemen in North Carolina came together. They created this hospital association that kind of became what is the modern day health insurance program. It would fail, but other communities would look at that and build it up and perfect it. Those two individuals would then try it again many years later, and they would create the Hospital Care Association, which today has become Blue Cross Blue Shield. In 1940, less than 10% of Americans had insurance. By 1955, it was 70%, and today it's 92%. But that was created out of two philanthropists that had a charitable idea for a way to kind of pool our money in this insurance concept. So philanthropy is responsible for concepts that we often take for granted today. So that's a little bit of the past. That's the big movements in time as it relates to big philanthropy, some of the specific stories of little p philanthropy and how financial resources have had a major impact in our society over time. And that gets us to today. And I'm going to get a little data heavy here at this point. So for folks who are not data, don't care much about data, I apologize. But I'm gonna geek out a little bit here on kind of current giving trends. And some of the best trends that we can get comes from an annual report called the Giving USA report, which calculates every year how much giving happens in this country, and is conducted by the Giving Institute and heavily funded by IU School of Philanthropy. $557 billion was given in 2023 by Americans. That was a growth of about 2% from the year prior, which is pretty common. And so we've kind of been at that 2% nominal growth year after year for the most part. Of course, if you consider inflation, which we've been living in a highly inflationary environment, total giving, real giving has actually declined over time, but nominally continues to go up. And this is a breakdown of kind of where giving comes from. 67% comes from living individuals. 8% come from individuals who are giving beyond their lifetime. 19% is coming from foundations and 7% from corporations. This has roughly kind of been these percentages over time, although post-pandemic, corporation giving, I think, dropped to about 3% at one point. Foundations have been going up in terms of the percentage over the last several years as more people pool their resources in foundations, but it hasn't fluctuated terribly over the last 10 years. And where does this giving go? The majority of giving in our country today goes to religious purposes, followed by human service, education, foundations, public society benefit, all the way down to individuals at the bottom. And so, again, part of what I opened up with is just, how important philanthropy has been in the American story, but how do we compare in terms of giving around the world? And there's two different ways to look at this. I kind of think of it as the big P philanthropy, love for mankind kind of way, and then kind of little p philanthropy, financially giving to charitable purposes. And so big P philanthropy, I think one way you can look at it is through something that's called the World Giving Index. It's conducted, this is conducted by the Charities Aid Foundation every year. And it's a mass study. It interviews 150,000 people, 142 countries, and asks three questions. Have you volunteered for an organization? Have you donated in the last year? And have you helped a stranger in need? And perhaps surprisingly, this is the top 10. Surprisingly, Indonesia tops this list, and actually has topped this list for the last 8 years, and by some margin as well. The United States comes in at 6, which, given what I've shared so far, you would expect we would be towards the top of the list. But you'll notice these are not all wealthy countries. Kenya, Gambia, Nigeria. And so it is not purely, the big P philanthropy story is not purely a story of wealthy countries. This culture of philanthropy, big P philanthropy, happens in many countries and with many people and cultures around the world. Also surprising if you look at the bottom 10. And again, saying wealthy countries don't necessarily play a role, you'll notice the second to last is Japan. And Japan's one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And yet, from kind of a big P philanthropy culturally, at least as it relates to how this study is conducted, they're very low on the list. But then, of course, you do see some less wealthy countries on the list here as well. But if we look at it through the lens of little p philanthropy, that financial giving for charitable purposes, the United States is far and away number one. And this study is a little bit old because it was the graph that I wanted to use, but I know the trend has continued. This is from 2016, also from the Charity Aid Foundation. But if you look at giving as a percentage of GDP, the United States comes in at 1.44%. The next closest is New Zealand and Canada, at just about half of that. And then you see another drop off before you see the United Kingdom, South Korea, Singapore. And so as you think about that little p philanthropy, the United States gives a vast share of the philanthropic resources globally. So why has philanthropy really flourished in the United States? Why has it played such a significant role? Well, the first thing I already I went at great lengths to talk about, but it is that kind of the early foundation of this country, those mutual aid societies, those associations, and just that uniquely philanthropic, raising dollars from the local community, everybody's chipping in. That has stuck with us. That has played out. That has become cultural for us over time. Second is free societies promote philanthropy. And so when you live in a free society, there is the freedom of ideas, the freedom to organize. And when you think of the opposite, when you think of authoritative countries, they don't want competition. They want all the ideas to come from the top. You've seen this in Russia over the last several years. They have been slowly removing charitable organizations from the country because it is competing with the ideas that should be reserved at the top. We are the longest standing democracy, so we've had longer to let that kind of play out, and I think that has played a significant role, that competition for ideas. Certainly, I think one of the absolute biggest factors is the strong religious convictions of many Americans throughout the history of our country. We have a high percentage of Americans historically that have identified primarily with Christianity and out of religious conviction. And this plays out in many of the major religions in the world, but there's an expectation of giving back. There's the tithing concept. And so that idea of charity is built into many folks' kind of cultural norms. And so that I believe has played a very significant role. The entrepreneur culture that has thrived throughout U.S. history. And I think this plays out in a couple different ways. One, again, if you think of some of those titans that I talked about in terms of their giving and their foundations, I think entrepreneurs often think different. They had to think different. They had to think creatively, innovatively to build up their companies. And then when they turn to their giving, they often think differently as well. And you think of Rockefeller, who is really thinking about swimming further upstream, trying to address root causes. That's different than just giving to the immediate need in front of you. But I also think it plays out because a lot of the wealthy individuals throughout American history that have become philanthropists often weren't wealthy to begin with. Again, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Ford, it was a rags to riches story. They knew what it was like to live in poverty or to have meager means. And so they saw the other side. And so when they had wealth, there is more of that drive to give back. That is a very different story than what played out in Europe at the time, where most of the wealth that was accumulated was landowners. It was aristocratic wealth. It was passed down from family to family. You always knew wealth, and you didn't know what it was like to live on kind of the other side of the fence. And I think that has played a significant role in our philanthropic story as well. And then, of course, just the sheer wealth. We're the wealthiest nation in history. And when you have more wealth, when you have more disposable income, after needs are often met, folks want to give back beyond meeting their own needs in terms of helping their communities as well. So while the American story has been a unique one, a special one, the reality is it's not all good news. And so even though nominal giving is going up every year, the number of households that give in this country has been steadily declining for about 20 years. And so we saw it peak in the early 2000s. About 2/3 of households were giving. We're about 20% lower now. About 46% of households give in this country today. So that is unfortunate news, that less Americans are participating in that joy of giving, and certainly that trend is heading in the wrong direction. But why is this happening? Why are fewer Americans? Why are fewer households giving? Well, there are a couple reasons. One is, well, religion has played a major role in how philanthropic the United States has been over time. The reality is that we have declining religious affiliations in this country, and so a Pew study that was according to Pew Research in the early 90s, over 90% of Americans identified as Christian. Only 5% had no religious affiliation. Today, 63% identify as Christians, and 29% are religiously affiliated, are not religiously affiliated. So 90% to 63, 5 to 29%. And I point out Christianity only because that is by far the largest affiliation, a religious affiliation in our country. And so, as I just got done sharing, if it is part of the culture, tithing and the expectation, the cultural aspect around that, and if there are fewer people that are feeling that conviction, you can see why giving may be declining. But there's also been changes in tax law. In 2017, tax reform doubled the standard deduction at the time, which means that less Americans needed to itemize their deductions. We saw 30% of Americans itemizing before the 2017 tax law change, only 10% after that. And there's been studies that have shown. So a recent study came out that said charitable giving declined by $20 billion in 2018 alone. And in the year after the tax law change, itemizers that switched to the standard deduction gave on average $880 less. And so study after study that asks about why people give, tax deductions is never the top reason. It is never, there are always greater convictions as to why people give charitably, but it is a factor. And so when that incentive is clawed back a little bit, you can see why giving may decline. Economic shocks. After every economic shock, you see a decline in giving. Great Recession, we saw a big dip. Post-COVID, we saw a big dip. And I think this, combined with the first two that I talked about, I think one of the things that ends up happening is people are, it's habitual. Giving is habitual. They're used to cutting a check every month, every week, whatever it might be for a certain purpose. And then when you have a shock that takes that away, you're no longer religiously affiliated, or your dollar doesn't go as far, you fall out of that habit. And I think it's really hard to get back into that habit of giving. Rising inflation, when the dollar doesn't go as far, certainly that giving is one of the first places that gets cut. And so when you're spending more money on eggs and gas and other things, that's less dollars that you can give to charitable purposes. And then this is an interesting one, that there's been a decline in confidence in institutions. And so there's been a lot of studies on this. The Gallup does a study every year where they're asking 16 different institutions and what is Americans' level of confidence in them. And they have been on a steady decline. Small business comes in at the top, but just in 2 years, it went from 70% to 65%, followed by military, the police, medical system. At the bottom, some may not be surprised to see Congress in the low single digits, followed by big business, television news, criminal justice system. But this trend has been happening for some time now. There's a separate study that is purely done on charitable organizations that reflects this as well, that people have a declining confidence or faith in nonprofit organizations. And so if you are less confident in certain institutions, you're likely less to give to them. I think this plays out pretty magnified right now with educational institutions, where if you don't have faith and confidence in what they're teaching, then I am less likely to cut a check to support that. And so many of these different institutions are charitably supported in some way. If I have less confidence, I'm less likely to give. So if giving is still going up nominally, yet there's been this drastic decline in households giving, how is giving continuing to go up? Well, the reality is, and big donors don't like it when I say this publicly, the reality is big donors are giving more and more each year. The wealthy are giving back a greater and greater percentage of the total pie. And that has been playing out very significantly over the last couple of years. This is a little bit, again, a little bit outdated here, but the total amount of typical U.S. Donor gave rose from 3,131 in 2018 to 3,651 in 2020, a 16% increase in 2 years. So again, fewer givers, but those who are giving a greater and greater percentage. So that captures some of the data, some of what's happening kind of trend-wise in philanthropy today. But there's also some major kind of broader trends that are taking place that I thought would be good to highlight as well. And kind of building on that theme that the wealthy are giving a bigger percentage of the pie, there's been significant movements for the wealthy to give back even more. The Giving Pledge was one of those significant moments, founded in 2010 by Warren Buffett and Bill and Melinda Gates, really encouraging billionaires, American billionaires at first, to pledge to sign at the kind of bottom dotted line, saying you would give the majority of your wealth away to charitable causes during your lifetime. And many have followed suit. There's been 244 total pledges. It's now spread to 30 countries being represented as well. But I think this helps emphasize just what's happening, that the wealthy are beginning to give away a greater and greater percentage of their resources. We're also seeing unique ways in which the wealthy are giving away their resources. Mark Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chan, his wife, kind of really brought this new way of giving to center stage in 2015. Historically, back to George Peabody and Carnegie and Rockefeller, the wealthy would give through a foundation. That was often the mechanism to do so. But there's now donors who are giving through limited liability companies, and there's a couple reasons to do that. So one is they don't have to disclose their giving. So if you are a foundation, you do have to publish all the grants that you make. People know where you're granting dollars to. If you have your own company, you don't have to disclose that. They also allow you to fund things beyond philanthropy. So you could fund startup companies, entrepreneurship, if you care about, like if you care about climate change, for example, maybe you fund a company that's trying to address that versus a charity that's trying to address. So it gives you a little bit more flexible options. And it also allows you to lobby and support political efforts, which is very limited. If you're a charitable organization, you can advocate, but you can't necessarily directly support a particular candidate. If you're an LLC, you can. So what they're missing out on is the charitable, the tax advantages of giving through a foundation. So this is a trend that is really picking up, and have seen other donors follow suit with that as well. We're also seeing a movement of sunsetting of foundations. So foundations have come under a lot of criticism in the last decade, purely because of the sheer number of assets that they're overseeing. You're seeing this play out at the national stage right now with a lot of criticism of Harvard endowment and some of these large endowments. But folks have said, hey, that's a lot of resources that you're not using. Put it back into the community, help meet the needs of community. And so you're seeing a trend. You're starting to see some sunsetting of foundations play out. And so here locally, I think we saw this just in the last year with Rich and Helen DeVos Foundation recently sunsetted. Bill and Melinda Gates have pledged that their mass foundation, one of the largest in history, will be spent down within 20 years of their passing. Callie, why am I drawing a blank on this one? Warren Buffett his kids have pledged to spend down his massive resources within 10 years of his passing. So this idea of sunsetting, of spending down your resources while you're alive or shortly after, is certainly a growing trend in philanthropy today. And then lastly, there's this trend around giving directly to individuals. And so this is playing out in a couple different ways. One, GoFundMe was created in 2010 as a way for folks to put out a need. You know, I need a housing repair, a furnace is broken, I have a healthcare, I have a hospital bill, whatever it is. And, you know, folks in my community or wherever can contribute to support that. It's not a charitable gift to give to an individual directly. But we've seen this grow. In the first 10 years of GoFundMe, $9 billion was given directly through that. By 2023, so within 13 years, that number had ballooned to 30 billion. So more and more folks are giving directly to folks in need. Microloans is another example of this. Muhammad Youssef and Grameen Bank in Bangladesh was kind of the original several decades ago to get this going, but you've seen Kiva, World Vision, others that have followed suit, and this idea of kind of supporting local entrepreneurship. I give a zero interest loan. Our family's been doing this through Kiva for many years. You know, you give to a farmer in Kenya to buy seeds, or a grocery store owner to buy dry goods to sell, and they pay you back over time with zero interest. And it's this idea of giving directly to someone, not through kind of an organization, but trying to get direct to the individual and support their economic livelihood. Direct cash assistance. This is something the Community Foundation actually experimented with during the pandemic. And you've seen a lot of organizations that have kind of, if you picture back to the early days of the pandemic, federal government providing stimulus checks directly to people. There's been organizations that have cropped up to try to do that mechanism as well. And so we experimented with this. We gave $500 checks to several hundred local Holland Zealand residents who were in need, and there were no strings attached. It was if you qualify based on certain conditions, you know, this is here to support you. And you're seeing other communities experiment with that kind of just direct cash assistance to individuals. So those are some of the trends from a data perspective, from a kind of big picture philanthropy trends that are happening today. And that gets us to where are we going from here? What does the future of philanthropy look like? And I don't know about the rest of you, but I sometimes struggle to see the future. And so these are guesses. Don't hold me to these. There are people who spend all day in academia sitting around thinking about where are we heading. But I do think there's some signs that you can kind of point to that lead to some of the conclusions that I have about where philanthropy is going. And the first thing I'll say is kind of the bad news. I don't see the number of households, American households giving. I don't see that trend really ramping back up. I don't think this is going to be a trough that all of a sudden we're going to have 2/3 of American households giving again in the next several years. And the reason for that is I think the things that have led to this aren't going to necessarily be reverted. I think between taxes, the decline in religious affiliations, I don't see those things necessarily changing and bringing back the number of a total American households that are giving. But I do think giving is going to thrive in this country, and I have hope for the future. And so this is something I think about a lot, because if you work in our industry, if you work in nonprofit, and you constantly are seeing and hearing stories of people in need, it's hard to think that the world's getting better. Or if you just turn on the news, it very much feels like the world is always worse than it was yesterday. And yet I think it's important to always put an objective lens on that. And so this is one book recommendation that I would have, Steven Pinker. It's a very, I think, poorly titled book, Enlightenment Now. Because what the book's really about is really objectively looking at mass trends in history related to quality of life, educational attainments, poverty, health, length of life, quality of life, violence, war, all these objective measures throughout history. And what you will find is that things are getting better. And I know that's hard to imagine. But they are. And I just bring that up because as we think about the future, I think there's tremendous hope for where we are heading as a country and where we're going to head as humanity. And so I share that because, and I believe personally that philanthropy has played a significant role in helping address a lot of those things I just named and things that are named in this book. And I think they're going to continue to have a significant impact. So when we look to the future of philanthropy, back to that question I started off with, where will the people look to for social good in society? We've seen some of the big movements. Where will they look to beyond this? So I have 4 predictions of some things to look out for here moving forward. The first is, I think employers will be one of the next big players. And I probably could have used employers as in telling the arc of philanthropy earlier. If you think about, again, some of the Carnegie, Rockefellers, that age of industrialization, I mean, workers worked long hours, unsafe conditions for very little wages. And over time, we've seen employers provide pensions and retirement benefits, healthcare benefits, other benefits to employees. And so I think employers already have played a significant role. Where do the people look to for social good? But I think you're going to see more of that, and look no further than what's happening here locally. We have a really profound shift that's happening right in our own backyard. I'm sure many of you have seen the news, but Gentex is building a child care center on site at one of their locations. They're going to provide child care to hundreds of their employees every single day. That is a big shift. I mean, if you think back 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago to say your employer is going to have an on-site daycare center, that's kind of hard to imagine. And of course, Gentex is not the only one. I mean, other employers are doing this around the country. I wouldn't say this is a mass trend as of yet, but there's other employers here locally that are going to be following suit as well. And so I look at that and I wonder what's next. As if employers are looking at the incredible affordable housing crisis that we have here locally, are they going to step into that space in some regard? Are they going to step in with transportation, which is a challenge for many employers, and getting employees there, rather than relying on public transportation? Are they going to provide their own transportation to employees? So I think you're seeing the early signs of this, and I think that is going to be a trend that very well could continue. And it's good for both the employer, right? That employees are happy at work, they're able to get to work, and it's good for the employee as well. This one is not much of a risk in taking, but I believe the generational wealth transfer is going to play a very, very significant role in kind of the arc of philanthropy here moving forward. And, we and I didn't get into the data here too much, but if you look at all the studies there, I mean, it's $84 trillion that is going to change hands from baby boomers to Gen X and to millennial generation. That's a lot of money. And not all of that money is going to go in the hands of heirs. And so I think this is going to be a moment in time where there are going to be a lot of those resources giving after someone's life that is going to be charitable in nature. I know this, I believe this, because these are the conversations I have all day long. I sit across from a lot of donors who say, I have more wealth than I thought I would have at this point in my life. And my kids don't need all of it. I don't want to leave them more than $500,000, $1 million, $2 million, whatever that number is. I don't want to incentivize them not to work. And so when we talk about that $84 trillion, I believe a lot of that is going to be captured in the hands of charitable organizations. I think it's going to be a big infusion for the financial sustainability of nonprofit organizations as those dollars go into things like endowments that can forever sustain nonprofit operations. So I think this is going to be a big deal. I think you're going to see the generational wealth transfer play a significant role in meeting a lot of the charitable needs in our country. I think direct cash assistance is going to transform social safety nets. I talked a little bit ago during present trends that there's some hints to look at, some trends to look at with giving cash directly to individuals that I think is going to play out at a much larger stage here at some point. And I could see this playing out in one of 2 ways. One is through government. I think there's, and don't laugh too hard, but I believe there is a case to be made that both sides of the political spectrum could come together. And it's this idea of giving cash directly to Americans in need. And I think the argument that will be made is, can we get away from, I showed all those reforms in the 60s, all the benefits, vouchers that have been provided. Can we get rid of all the bureaucracy related to these individual benefits? This isn't me saying this, but I think there's a case to be made. And instead just give dollars directly to people in need for whatever their need is. We can save money over here, and we can help address more of the acute issue. And I think there's a case to be made there because if you think about it, and I don't think this will play out in terms of kind of the universal income experiment that is playing out in some countries and some communities, even in the US, because I think it's hard to make a case that the Warren Buffetts and Mark Zuckerberg, like, I don't think there's going to be a case to be cutting every American a check, but at a certain level, percentage of poverty or whatever it is, that there's some amount of money that goes directly. And I think this makes sense in one way, is that not all individuals that are in financial need have the same needs. And so you may have someone who is at the same exact socioeconomic class. And for one individual, they have a neighbor or a cousin or a mother or someone who can care for their child. And they don't need a child care voucher, even though they would qualify for one. So they're good. But they live in Holland, Zealand, and housing is incredibly unaffordable. And so maybe they need more resources to go towards their housing. You could have the exact same socioeconomic status, someone else who has a housing situation. Maybe they're in a community that doesn't have such a housing crisis. Or maybe they live with a roommate, or they have a situation that works for them, but they don't have that person to care for their child. And so I think there's going to be a case made of, let's not carve up all these individual benefits, but rather let's just give dollars directly and let folks figure out where their needs best could be met. So that's how it plays out the federal government level or state level potentially. I also think there's a nonprofit case that could be made here, where you could have a nonprofit model where you take a household in our neighborhood that's struggling, and does my family chip in $100 a month, and 10 other neighbors or 10 other folks locally also chip in, and before you know it, you've helped one household kind of just get enough beyond that living on the margins. And I think there's a model there as well that could be that could be created and built up purely in the kind of charitable organization space. So I think we will see this play out in terms of kind of where philanthropy is headed. But ultimately, the biggest change, the biggest impact is going to be technology and innovation. And if you heard some of the stories I shared earlier about vaccines and radar and these things that really have moved society forward in very significant ways, I think that's what's going to happen in terms of philanthropy moving forward. If you think about what's happening today with just weight loss drugs, Ozempic and others, obesity has been a massive challenge for our country for a long time, and we are seeing rates significantly decline. And you can argue about the health and well-being of individuals, but there's no questioning the data that obesity rates are going down. And I look at that and I say, what else could a pill do, right? What happens when we design that pill that can cure some significant diseases, other diseases, that are present in this country? What happens, and I'm going to go out here even a little further, what happens when we can design one pill that can provide all of your nutritional calories and value for the entire day, and you can mass ship that pill anywhere in the world? What does that do to address food insecurity? What happens when we can 3D print homes on demand, where you've taken all the labor construction out and you can just print homes to address a very significant issue in our community? Like these are the kind, I know it seems far-fetched, but if you would have tried to describe this to someone 100 years ago and all the power that is on here, it's unfathomable to think of where you could go. And so I think technology, I think innovation is going to continue to play that role. If you look at just climate change alone, I mean, there are some companies that are doing things, capturing carbon in massive limestones that it's very inefficient, and it's not cost affordable right now, but they're on some cutting edge. They're creating some cutting edge technology that could completely shift the landscape when it comes to something like climate change. And so, artificial intelligence. Everyone wants to know, what is AI going to do for my industry? What is that AI going to mean for me? When it comes to the philanthropic landscape, I think it's going to have a profound change. I think about mental health, which is another one of those issues that the data just keeps heading in the wrong direction. But we also know that there's a massive access issue, that people are not accessing resources for mental health. Well, what happens when someone can just remove the stigma of going and seeing someone in person, but I could just talk to artificial intelligence that is well trained in that space, that can guide me through the needs that I have? What does that do to address mental health rates in this country? What does it do when what does AI do to transform teaching and educational opportunities for youth and for adults in this country? So I think kind of closing argument is I think the future we can't see, but technology and innovation is going to continue to help kind of be that place where people look to for social good in society. So in closing, and hopefully I have just a few minutes here if folks have questions, I think two takeaways that I would hope you got from today. And one is just the uniquely American story with philanthropy and just the significant role philanthropy has played in helping to shape this country. Hopefully there's a few fun stories there that maybe you didn't know before that you might retell later. And then second, that there's hope for the future, that we don't know what's coming, but philanthropy is going to continue to play a significant role in shaping the world that ultimately we all want. So with that, thank you for your time and attention. Thanks for letting me geek out a little bit on philanthropy here today. And I think we have a little time if anyone has any questions.
Patrick, thank you. Your speeches and presentations are always uniquely educational, and I always take something from that. Patrick, I want to thank you for what you're doing with the foundation and how that helps West Michigan. And as a personal recipient, I want to thank you for a desire to help support the nonprofit leaders and teaching them how to sustain themselves and be part of a community, because that is what has, in my opinion, made a big difference in this community. So thank you for what you're doing. I wonder, as a question, if because of your experiences, both before with nonprofits and now in the foundation category, this concept of transfer of wealth, these $84 trillion that are moving, I think I hear a number of people, I feel it myself, how, if we could do one or two things, how could we really affect positively the next generation who are receiving these tremendous funds? What would you say you have seen has been successful in people that you talk to?
Yeah, thanks, Jack. And you've heard me speak several times. So again, if you think about the role, I talked about religion and how as part of religion, there's that expectation. It's cultural, that you give back. I think what my hope would be is that plays out in families as well. And that if you are a philanthropist, if you give back, if you volunteer, whether it's big P philanthropy, little P philanthropy, if you care about the community, that you're striving to kind of carry on that tradition with your heirs and with your family. And we get to see that at the Community Foundation. So we get to see families who are very philanthropically involved, and they set up a fund that now they and their kids are jointly advising on. And they're teaching, or they set up a fund that is purely for the kids, and you wrestle with what to give to. I have a 4 and 5 year old, and I've even talked to my wife about, like, monthly setting up a ritual of just giving them a small amount of money and, hey, here's 3 organizations. Where do you want to give it? And just like letting a 4 and 5-year-old wrestle with, they like this logo over that logo, or like, I don't even know if it matters at that stage, but just somehow passing on that tradition, because philanthropy and giving back, it is addictive. I mean, it is one of the, endorphins go off in and there's studies, endorphins go off in your brain when you write a check to a charitable organization. It feels good. And so I believe the more people we can invite in to that practice and make it kind of habitual, make it a cultural aspect, the better off we'll be. So I think teaching and passing down to future generations.
Two-part question. Part A is, how do the dynamics of the Community Foundation Holland Zealand differ from West Michigan, places like Grand Haven or other places? And then part B is, if across the state, east side of the state, northern part of Michigan, et cetera.
So I want to make sure I understand the question. So so the state of Michigan is really a unique one. I will say it first, in the fact that every territory, every piece of land in Michigan is actually covered by a community foundation. So some are multi-county in the UP, they're massive. We have 2 here in Ottawa County alone. So Grand Haven has a community foundation, Holland Zealand has a community foundation. So they are everywhere. They all look and feel a little bit different, but I want to make sure I understand specifically what you're asking related to that.
Is the focus different on how we do business generally in
Got it.
Holland versus Grand Haven, Sam?
Yeah. So I would say 75% of how community foundations are structured are pretty similar across the board. So we often say what we do at the community foundation is twofold. We build up the community's endowment, which is an asset that donors have been given to faithfully for many, many years. And that's what we grant dollars back out into the hands of local nonprofits every year. That's community's endowment. And then the other half of what we do is we come alongside individual donors and help them achieve their charitable goals. And we have a number of fund types and services that we can provide that do that. I would say that's the case with every community foundation you will find. I think there's some nuance is where you focus your time and effort. So, for example, with our grant making, we have what we call responsive grant making, which is kind of, we support any local nonprofit with their projects. But we also have proactive, where we've named 3 priorities that we're really trying to go after. Some community foundations do that, others do not. Some community foundations may put more focus on scholarships, for example, and less, and others may not focus as much there. So I think it really it depends on the unique needs in the community, but it also depends on the donors that you're working with and what their desires are. So 75% is probably transferable across the board, and 25% is probably pretty unique. But I will say we have partnered with Grand Haven Community Foundation in particular many times over the years, during COVID, to address affordable housing issues in our community and a lot of other things. So.
I give to charities gradually, but the next day I'll get another ad for the same thing from them, and it just goes on. And that makes you think, well, this is bureaucracy. So what do I do? And another comment, AI is taking over, but how many of you don't proofread what you've put in? Because it comes out totally abstract from it.
Yeah. So I hope you're not seeing any of that from the community foundation. But yeah, I mean, certainly I think nonprofits, you got to be mindful of how much you're communicating. Are you over communicating? Are you over asking? You got to know your donor base. And so I can offer is hopefully organizations should be figuring that out. And AI should never be the final result of sending something out. It is a good starting place. I did a workshop for my church not too long ago, and there was so much I was trying to say, and I was really struggling with what's a title I can put in the bulletin. And so I just talked into my phone and it spit out 4 ideas to title it. And that, by golly, it was better than what I could have come up with myself. So I do think it plays its role, but you gotta, you don't want to take it at face value. Hey, Peg.
Patrick, with so many people getting the benefit of philanthropy, and I'll look at scholarships as one example, with so much less emphasis on religious input to people's value systems, how are the recipients learning the benefit of what they're getting and then turning right around and making the contributions to somebody else? Do you get any idea? I know there are sometimes required classes, but
You're-
that's a small drop in the bucket.
You were gonna get me on my soapbox, Peg. One of my biggest frustrations is the hollowing out of civics in our local schools. This is something I've talked about in a lot of different settings, but I completely, I wrestle with that because I think there has to, if it's not happening if it's not happening in the church, if it's not happening in the family, where is it happening? And for a long time, at least in our education system, you took civics, which isn't the all encompassing, but it teaches you, you got to vote and you've got rights that are expected of you in serving in civil society and, you know, volunteering, giving back, like those principles. I don't know where they're being taught, if we're seeing it less in the church, less in the family. But I'm hopeful that there's an opportunity in the education system to provide some of that at some point.
With more and more of us being de-churched, we still carry forward the same principles of, you know, blessed to be a blessing, or to whom much is given, much is expected, and so on. Just sitting here, it's curious that, and I've worked in churches, mega churches for a long time, and I know where a lot of the funds go. So it almost feels like Community Foundation could potentially be postured. Because churches used to distribute the money. You give and they distribute it. And I'm just intrigued. I mean, we could give to the foundation and say, designate this for Community Action House.
Mm-hmm.
But it hadn't occurred to me to give to you and say, hey, we'll trust you and the board to distribute. You see yourself in that role somewhat?
I'm happy to chat with you afterwards.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, you're singing my story for me. I believe the Community Foundations, I mean, we are unique animals that can play a very significant role in communities. So, absolutely. I don't want to say replacing kind of what you know, churches and others you know, would do, but in terms of being a centralized place for and it's back to Frederick Goff in 1914. Meeting the needs of the community, pulling it in one place to kind of steward those resources on behalf of whatever the community needs are today, but and in the future. And that is, I mean, that's what's so important about community foundations is you are giving resources to us for today, but that we don't know what the needs are going to be 20, 30, 50 years from now, but we'll be around and we'll be stewarding those resources. So try not to make too much of a plug for myself, but yeah. It's a good observation. Okay, thanks everyone.
Thank you, Patrick.